Congratulations to Derek Chen on his promotion to Senior Operations Manager. That was the entire message. No warning. No meeting. No conversation. Just an HR announcement sent company-wide, naming the man who'd just been promoted into the role I'd been promised. I read it twice, waiting for my name to appear below his. It never did. 6 months of documented assurances, performance reviews, and succession planning vanished in a single email, final, official, and already archived by HR before I could ask a single question. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, trying to process what had just happened. Around me, the office continued normally. People packing up for the day. Conversations about weekend plans. Someone laughing in the break room. I logged out of my computer. Gathered my things. Walked to my car in a daze. The commute home was a blur. When I finally sat down at my kitchen table, the anger arrived. Not loud. Not explosive. Just a slow, burning realization that something was deeply wrong. I'd done everything right. Every metric. Every deadline. Every expectation. My last performance review, completed just 2 months ago, had been glowing. Paul had rated me as exceeds expectations in every category. He'd specifically noted my leadership potential. My ability to manage complex projects. My readiness for advancement. And yet, when the position opened, I wasn't even told it was being filled. No heads up. No explanation. No interview. Just an announcement that someone else had gotten the role I'd been promised. I pulled out my laptop and opened my work files. Started reviewing everything from the past 6 months. Looking for the moment I'd missed something. The feedback I'd ignored. The mistake that had disqualified me. I found nothing. Just consistent praise. Steady advancement. Clear communication that I was on track. Until suddenly, I wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying conversations with Paul. The ones where he'd talked about my future at the company. Where he'd outlined the path to senior leadership. Where he'd told me, explicitly, that I was ready. I'd believed him. I'd turned down a job offer from a competitor 8 months ago because Paul had assured me my loyalty would be rewarded. That staying was the right move. That my time was coming. Now I understood. My time hadn't been coming. It had been given to someone else. And I'd been kept in the dark until it was too late to do anything about it. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Paul. He responded within an hour. Sure, let's connect Monday. I waited through the weekend. Ran through every possible explanation. Maybe Derek had skills I didn't. Maybe there was a business reason I wasn't seeing. Maybe this was about something other than merit. Monday morning, I sat across from Paul in the same conference room where he'd told me I was being groomed for leadership. And I asked the question directly. Why wasn't I considered for the promotion? Paul shifted in his seat. Said it had been a competitive process. That Derek brought fresh energy to the role. That sometimes organizations need new perspectives. I asked if I'd done something wrong. He said no. I asked if there were areas I needed to improve. He said my work was excellent. I asked why I hadn't been interviewed. And that's when his answer changed everything. He said the decision had been made above his level. That he'd advocated for me. But leadership had gone in a different direction. Let me tell you who I actually am. My name is Jordan Hayes. I'm 34 years old. I've worked in operations management for over a decade. I started at this company as a coordinator. Worked my way up through every level. Learned every system. Built relationships across departments. Became the person people called when something went wrong because I knew how to fix it. My performance reviews reflected that. Year after year. Exceeds expectations. Strong leadership potential. Critical team member. Paul himself had written in my most recent review that I was one of the most reliable and capable managers in the department. Those weren't empty words. They were documented assessments. Official evaluations. Part of my permanent record. And yet, when the promotion decision was made, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was something else. Something Paul wouldn't name directly. Something decided, above his level, by people who'd barely interacted with me. I left that meeting knowing I wouldn't get a real answer from him. So I decided to do something different. Something he wouldn't expect. I started documenting everything. Not emotionally. Not defensively. Just carefully preserving the record of what had been promised and what had actually happened. The first thing I did was compile my performance reviews. All 7 years. I organized them chronologically and highlighted every mention of leadership, advancement, and readiness for promotion. The language was consistent. Year after year, the same themes. Strong leadership skills. Ready for increased responsibility. High potential for advancement. Then I pulled the emails. Every message from Paul over the past 2 years where he discussed my career trajectory. There were dozens. Some were brief check-ins. Others were longer conversations about strategy and timing. But the through line was clear. He'd been preparing me for this role. Explicitly. Repeatedly. I have you in mind for the next senior opening, he'd written in one email from 10 months ago. You're exactly the kind of leader we need at the next level. I took screenshots. Saved the original messages to a personal folder. Created a timeline showing when these conversations happened and what was said. Then I looked at Derek's record. His performance reviews were good. Not exceptional. Good. His project history showed competence. But nothing that outpaced what I'd done. Nothing that explained why he'd leapfrog over someone with 7 years of institutional knowledge and consistently higher ratings. The gap wasn't about skill. It was about something else. And I needed to figure out what. I didn't confront anyone. Didn't send angry emails or demand explanations. I just kept working. Showed up every day. Delivered results. Acted like nothing had changed. But quietly, I started paying attention differently. To who got promoted. Who got passed over. Who got opportunities and who didn't. And I noticed a pattern. In the past 3 years, 5 senior-level positions had opened in operations. All 5 had gone to men. 4 of those men had less experience than the women who'd been in the department longer. 3 had been hired externally while internal candidates, all women, were told they weren't quite ready. I pulled the company's diversity reports. Public documents they filed annually. The numbers were stark. At the coordinator and manager level, the gender split was roughly even. At the senior manager and director level, it was 80% male. The gap wasn't subtle. It was structural. And I was part of the pattern. I'd been told I was ready. Groomed. On track. Right up until the moment a man with less experience was chosen instead. And when I asked why, I was told it was a business decision. Made above Paul's level. By leadership I'd never met. Who didn't know my work. Who didn't review my record. Who just made a decision. And moved on. I scheduled a meeting with HR 3 weeks after the promotion announcement. Not to file a complaint. Just to ask questions. To understand the process. To see if there was a formal explanation I'd missed. The HR representative, a woman named Stephanie, listened politely as I explained my situation. I kept my tone neutral. Didn't accuse anyone. Just presented the timeline. The promises. The performance reviews. The sudden decision to promote someone else without telling me. Stephanie took notes. Said she'd look into it. Said these things were complicated. Said sometimes business needs shifted in ways that weren't always communicated clearly. I asked if there was a record of why Derek was chosen over internal candidates. She said she'd have to check. I asked if the decision had been based on a formal evaluation process. She said she'd follow up. A week later, she emailed. Said she'd reviewed my file. Said everything appeared to be in order. Said the promotion decision had been made based on organizational fit and strategic alignment. I read that email 3 times. Organizational fit. Strategic alignment. Corporate language that meant nothing and everything. It didn't explain why Derek fit better. It didn't explain what strategic alignment meant. It just provided cover. A reason that sounded official but couldn't be challenged. Because how do you argue against fit? I didn't let it go. I requested a copy of my complete personnel file. Everything the company had on record about my employment. HR was required to provide it. It took 2 weeks, but it arrived. 60 pages of documents. Hiring paperwork. Performance reviews. Salary history. Training certifications. And buried near the end, something I'd never seen before. A memo from 8 months ago. Written by someone in senior leadership I'd never met. The subject line read, Succession Planning, Operations. I read it carefully. It outlined potential candidates for upcoming senior roles. My name was on the list. So was Derek's. But next to my name, there was a note. Strong performer. Concerns about long-term commitment due to age and potential family planning. Next to Derek's name, high potential. Eager. Unencumbered. I stared at those words. Read them again. Then again. Age and potential family planning. I was 34. Unmarried. No children. I'd never discussed family planning at work. Never mentioned wanting kids. Never indicated that my personal life would interfere with my career. But someone had decided it might. And that possibility had been noted. Documented. Used to justify passing me over. I took a photo of the memo. Saved it. And called a lawyer. The employment attorney I contacted specialized in workplace discrimination. Her name was Sandra Diaz. I walked her through everything. The promises. The performance reviews. The promotion going to someone less experienced. The HR response. And finally, the memo. She read it twice. Then she looked up at me. This is textbook gender discrimination, she said. They didn't deny you the promotion because you weren't qualified. They denied it because they assumed you might have children someday. And that assumption only applies to women. I asked what I could do. She explained my options. I could file a complaint with the EEOC. I could pursue internal resolution through the company's grievance process. Or I could do both. But she warned me. These cases are hard. Even with a smoking gun memo like this, companies have resources. Lawyers. Strategies to delay and discredit. And retaliation, while illegal, happens. I asked what retaliation looked like. She said it could be subtle. Negative performance reviews. Reduced responsibilities. Hostile work environment. Or it could be direct. Termination. Forced resignation. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked what she recommended. She said document everything. Don't quit. Don't give them a reason to say you were underperforming. And let me handle the legal process. I agreed. We filed the EEOC complaint 2 weeks later. The complaint was formal. Detailed. It outlined the timeline. The performance reviews showing I was qualified. The emails from Paul saying I was being groomed for promotion. The promotion going to a less experienced male colleague. And the memo. The one that cited age and potential family planning as a concern. That memo became the center of everything. Because it wasn't vague. It wasn't subjective. It was written evidence that my gender had been considered in a promotion decision, which is illegal. The EEOC acknowledged receipt. Said they'd investigate. Said it could take months. I kept working. Stayed professional. Didn't tell anyone except my lawyer what was happening. But I noticed changes. Paul stopped including me in strategic meetings. Projects I'd normally lead were reassigned. My responsibilities quietly shrank. Nothing dramatic. Nothing I could point to as obvious retaliation. Just a slow marginalization. Like I was being phased out without being fired. I documented all of it. Every meeting I was excluded from. Every project I was removed from. Every responsibility that disappeared. I kept a log. Dated. Detailed. Clinical. Because I knew what was coming. And I knew I'd need proof. 4 months after I filed the complaint, the EEOC investigator contacted the company. Requested documents. Interviewed witnesses. Asked HR to explain the promotion process and the memo. The company's legal team responded. They said the memo had been taken out of context. That it didn't reflect company policy. That the promotion decision had been based solely on merit and organizational needs. They said Derek was simply the best candidate. That my gender had nothing to do with it. The investigator asked for documentation supporting that claim. Performance evaluations. Interview notes. Scoring rubrics. Anything showing how the decision was made. The company provided some documents. But they were thin. Generic. There were no interview notes because I'd never been interviewed. There were no scoring rubrics because no formal evaluation had occurred. There was just the decision. And the memo. The investigator asked the company to explain the memo directly. Who wrote it? Why it referenced family planning. How that factor had been considered. The company said it was an error. That the person who wrote it had since left the organization. That it didn't represent their values or practices. But the documents still existed. Dated. Filed. Part of the official succession planning record. And no amount of backtracking could erase that. 6 months after the EEOC complaint was filed, I received a call from Sandra. The EEOC had issued a determination. They found reasonable cause to believe that discrimination had occurred. It wasn't a final ruling. But it meant the evidence was strong enough that they believed my claim had merit. And it meant I could now file a lawsuit if I chose to. Or I could pursue settlement. Sandra recommended settlement. Not because the case was weak. But because litigation would take years. Cost both sides significant money. And even if I won, the company would appeal. A settlement could resolve it faster. Get me compensation. And force the company to make policy changes. I asked what kind of settlement she thought was possible. She said it depended on what I wanted. Back pay for the promotion I should have gotten. Compensation for emotional distress. Attorney fees. And possibly, a commitment from the company to review their promotion practices. I told her I wanted one more thing. I wanted the memo removed from my file. And I wanted a written acknowledgement that the decision had been flawed. She said she'd try. 2 weeks later, the company reached out. They wanted to talk. The settlement negotiation happened in a conference room downtown. Neutral territory. My attorney on one side. The company's legal team on the other. They opened with an offer. A financial settlement. No admission of wrongdoing. A mutual non-disparagement agreement. Standard corporate resolution. Sandra countered. She said the financial offer was too low given the evidence. She said I wanted policy changes. Training for leadership on gender bias. A review of recent promotion decisions. And the memo removed. The company resisted. Said they couldn't admit the memo was discriminatory without opening themselves to liability. said policy changes would imply systemic problems. Sandra pointed out that the EEOC had already found reasonable cause. That if this went to litigation, the memo would be Exhibit A. That a jury would see it exactly for what it was. Evidence of gender-based decision-making. The room went quiet. Then the company's lead attorney asked what it would take to resolve this. Sandra laid it out. A settlement that reflected the salary I would have earned if promoted. Removal of the memo from all files. A commitment to third-party review of promotion practices in the operations department. And a neutral reference. No retaliation. No blacklisting. They said they'd consider it. The settlement took 3 more weeks to finalize. But eventually, they agreed. The financial terms were confidential. But they covered the difference in salary I would have earned over 2 years if I'd been promoted when promised. They removed the memo from my personnel file and confirmed in writing that it didn't reflect company policy. They committed to hiring an external consultant to review promotion practices and provide training on unconscious bias. And they agreed that if I chose to leave, they'd provide a neutral reference confirming my dates of employment and role. No disparagement. No retaliation. I signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning. By that afternoon, the money had been transferred. The memo was gone. And I had something I hadn't expected. Vindication. Not public. Not loud. But institutional. The company hadn't admitted wrongdoing in a press release. But they'd admitted it in the settlement terms. In the money they paid. In the policy changes they agreed to. In the memo they erased. The system had worked. Not because I'd argued emotionally. But because I'd documented everything. And let the EEOC examine the evidence. I stayed at the company for 3 more months after the settlement. Long enough to finish the projects I was committed to. Long enough to transition my responsibilities properly. Long enough to prove I wasn't leaving in shame or defeat. Then I gave my notice. Paul seemed surprised. Asked if there was anything he could do to make me stay. I said no. The decision was made. He didn't ask why. I think he knew. My last day was quiet. No big goodbye lunch. No speeches. Just a few handshakes and well wishes from colleagues who didn't know the full story. I packed my desk. Returned my badge. Walked out of the building for the last time. And I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Freedom. Freedom from wondering if my gender would be held against me. Freedom from working twice as hard to prove I was half as committed as my male colleagues. Freedom from a system that claimed to value merit but rewarded assumptions. 3 weeks later, I started a new job. Better title. Better pay. Better leadership. And on my first day, my new manager said something that caught me off guard. We hired you because you're the best at what you do. Not the best woman. The best. Period. Looking back now, I understand what happened more clearly. The company didn't set out to discriminate against me. They just operated on assumptions. Assumptions about women my age. About priorities. About commitment. And those assumptions, left unchallenged, became policy. The person who wrote that memo probably didn't think they were breaking the law. They probably thought they were being practical. Planning for contingencies. Considering risk. But gender isn't a risk factor. And family planning isn't a legitimate business concern. The law is clear about that. Even if corporate culture isn't. What made this case winnable wasn't that the discrimination was obvious. It was that it was documented. Someone had written it down. Filed it. Made it part of the official record. And once that happened, no amount of backtracking could erase it. I didn't win because I was morally right. I won because I had evidence. Performance reviews. Emails. A memo. A timeline. And a lawyer who knew how to use them. I think about Derek sometimes. Not with anger. Not even with resentment. Just with curiosity. Did he know about the memo? Did he know I'd been passed over? Did he ever ask why someone with 7 years of experience wasn't considered for a role he got after 2? I don't know. We never spoke about it. And I don't blame him. He didn't write the memo. He didn't make the decision. He just benefited from a system that assumed he was a safer bet because he was male and therefore unencumbered. That's how structural discrimination works. It's not always malicious. It's often just lazy. People make assumptions. They prioritize candidates who look like previous successful leaders. They avoid risk by choosing the familiar. And in doing so, they perpetuate patterns they claim to oppose. The company's diversity reports showed they wanted gender equity. Their hiring practices at lower levels reflected that. But when it came to senior roles, when it came to power and leadership and long-term investment, the assumptions took over. And women got passed over. Not because they weren't qualified. But because someone decided they might not stay. Might have other priorities. Might not be worth the risk. That's what the memo said. And that's what the settlement acknowledged, quietly, without admitting fault. The external review the company agreed to as part of the settlement was completed 8 months after I left. I wasn't there to see it. But I heard things. Through former colleagues. Through professional networks. The consultant found patterns. Systematic underrepresentation of women in senior operations roles. Vague evaluation criteria that allowed subjective bias. Lack of transparency in promotion decisions. They made recommendations. Structured interview processes. Diverse hiring panels. Regular audits of promotion outcomes. Whether the company implemented those recommendations, I don't know. I'd like to think they did. I'd like to think my case forced a reckoning. But I also know how organizations work. Changes get announced. Policies get written. And then, slowly, things drift back to normal. Because changing culture is harder than changing policy. And culture is where the real assumptions live. But I did what I could. I didn't stay silent. I didn't accept vague explanations. I didn't let the memo disappear quietly. And because of that, at least one company had to confront what they'd done. Even if only behind closed doors. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've been told you're ready for promotion only to watch it go to someone less experienced, if you've been given vague explanations about fit or alignment, I want you to know something. Document everything. Save the emails where you're praised. Save the performance reviews that say you're ready. Save the messages that outline your career path. Because if the decision changes, you'll need proof that the promises were real. And you'll need proof that the justification doesn't match the record. Ask questions. Why wasn't I considered? What criteria were used? Who made the decision? If the answers are vague, that's information. If you're told it was decided above someone's level, that's information. If you're excluded from a process you were told you'd be part of, that's information. And all of that information can become evidence. If you find a memo like I did, if you discover documentation that shows gender or age or family status was considered, contact an employment attorney immediately. Because that's not just unfair. It's illegal. And there are systems in place to address it. They're slow. They're frustrating. But they work. When you give them the right evidence. The promotion I was denied happened 3 years ago. I'm in a different company now. Different role. Different culture. And I've been promoted twice since I left. Not because I'm exceptional. But because I'm evaluated fairly. On my work. On my results. On my contributions. Not on assumptions about what I might do in my personal life someday. That's what equity looks like. Not special treatment. Not advantages. Just evaluation based on merit. Actual merit. Not filtered through bias. I don't think about the old company often. But when I do, I think about the memo. The one they tried to explain away. The one they said was taken out of context. The one they paid me to make go away. And I wonder how many other memos exist. In how many other files. About how many other women. Who were told they were ready. Who were passed over. Who were given explanations that sounded reasonable but weren't. Who didn't have documentation. Or didn't know they could fight. Or didn't have the resources to hire a lawyer. I was lucky. Not because I was treated fairly. But because I had proof I wasn't. So here's what I want you to take from this. Workplace discrimination still exists. It's just quieter now. More polite. Hidden in memos and succession plans and decision-making processes that happen behind closed doors. It sounds like business strategy. It sounds like organizational fit. It sounds like leadership making tough calls. But when you look at the patterns, when you examine who gets promoted and who doesn't, when you read the language in the documents they don't think you'll ever see, the truth becomes clear. Gender still matters. Age still matters. Assumptions about family and commitment and priorities still shape decisions. Even in companies that publish diversity reports and claim to value inclusion. The difference is documentation. If it's written down, it can be challenged. If it's documented, it can be proven. And if it's proven, the system can intervene. I didn't win because I was louder. I didn't win because I made a scene. I won because someone wrote down their bias. And I had the records to show it violated the law. That's the power of evidence. It doesn't argue. It just exists. And when it enters a legal process, it speaks louder than any corporate explanation. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been passed over for a promotion you were promised, if you've ever wondered whether your gender played a role in a decision you'll never fully understand, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if you've faced something similar. Because these stories matter. Not just as warnings. But as proof that the system can work when you give it evidence. That documentation defeats discrimination. That patterns can be exposed. That companies can be held accountable. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about workplace justice. About quiet victories. About what happens when the overlooked stop accepting explanations and start building cases. Because the world is full of memos like mine. Written by people who don't think they're discriminating. Filed by people who don't think anyone will ever see them. But they exist. And when they surface, they can't be explained away. They promoted him over me. HR found the real reason. And the real reason was written down. In the end, that's all that mattered.